And welcome everyone to the first sig-architecture meeting, July 10th, 2017. And I am your co-host along with Brian Grant. But this is a community affair and we are very excited to get this kicked off. I want to apologize up front that the notification on this came a bit late. I thought it was more widely publicized than it was. So probably this meeting will be more focused on just getting the lay of the land for the SIG and discussing if we're at the right meeting cadence and discussing what we want to accomplish long term and less on policy decisions. So without much further ado, the agenda is available at bit.ly/sig-architecture. I will also paste a link in the chat, which will be available for you to look at.
So,
and yeah, so without further ado, let's get started. Brian, do you want to give a little background on why this SIG was so important for you to want to help drive?
yeah, there are a bunch of areas that I have been driving, but haven't been adequately socialized across the entire project. Some things have been, some of the materials have existed for a long time, like the API conventions document, which was written principally by Clayton, but it was a collaboration. But more recently, I've been trying to evolve more clearly describe the architecture broken down into kind of coarse-grained chunks to help people understand how the system is structured or how we would like the system to be structured. And effectively, the system was initially intended to be modular, which is why we have a lot of independent control loops, for example. But in practice has evolved as a monolithic system with principally two monolithic binaries. And we don't really have any mechanism by which we can break them up, at least optionally, for some deployments that want that. Additionally, with the upcoming conformance effort to try to ensure application portability among lots of different Kubernetes distributions and services, a number of things are kind of coming to a head all at the same time, like the pain points with the monorepo, and so on. So there seemed to be critical mass to kind of broaden the effort beyond just me. So that's what SIG architecture is intended to do, and as well as to be a home for efforts that didn't really have a clear home, like breaking up the repository into multiple repositories, or at least better supporting multiple repositories, if you want to look at it that way, since we already have at least 3 GitHub orgs and many repositories at this point. We're working on a number of extension mechanisms, and it isn't necessarily clear to everyone why we're working on all of them or what the different use cases for the different mechanisms are as well. So, the SIG architecture, that would be one of the responsibilities, to provide some clarity on that. And I know that already there have been some questions come up about some of the parts of the proposal and what it means. So clearly there's work to do to clarify that. And we would like to get the proposal documents converted to Markdown and checked in and approved. There's actually no process really for actually making any kind of feature proposal. We have been kind of cargo culting an informal process, but I would advocate that formalizing that process should be done by SIG architecture as well, since it's not really clear who else would own that. So there's a lot of work to do. So hopefully we can get more people involved. And yeah, I'm happy to see at least some folks here, even if many of them are usual suspects. We have a few others as well.
Great. And so in terms of the mission moving forward too, I think having a consistent architectural vision over time, I think, is going to be held in this group. I think that's super important to have that guiding light in terms of what is consistent with the design principles and what isn't, especially when it comes time to vet different features or things that might get moved into core or out of core and whatnot. So I think that's another huge thing, is just to maintain consistency so that there's a reliable source of truth for what feels like it's in the ballpark and what isn't, and to have those reviews.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the first things we need to do is to write up the charter for the SIG. A lot of that is contained in email, actually.
Yep.
So we should take that and use that as a starting point and flesh it out a little bit and try to get that checked in. Is that, I assume that would just go in our subdirectory in the community repo?
I believe so, yes. But I think that's, I think Sarah's on this call. Sarah, is there an indicator of what the proper way to socialize the charter is?
We've generally done Google Docs and then published it once the discussion has died down a bit with a link in the GitHub to the original Google Doc.
Okay, great. I will, as a to-do before the next architecture meeting, I will make sure that that's started and that we start integrating this information that Brian's already got live. So look for a link in the sig-architecture Google mailing list for that document coming up, and I'll share it with the group as well. Okay, great. So clear mandate for the SIG, a lot of buy-in. Clearly at the community, when we had the leadership meeting, there was overwhelming support for this SIG, which is exciting to see. Especially since SIGs are sometimes feel a bit like there's a lot of them. So in terms of our work moving forward, Brian, you've got a number of documents, and one of the things was a presentation that was that went over during the leadership meeting. I don't know if you want to kind of hit some of the high points of that, but I think for people maybe who are new to this effort to understand the stratification that you're sort of proposing and the way that you're developing the taxonomy around that, I think would be really interesting for people to get just an idea what that is.
Sure, I could do that. Although first I was interested in hearing from other people who are on the meeting about what they were hoping to get out of sig-architecture or ways in which they thought they would contribute.
Yeah, good point.
So one thing that we have come across numerous times in service catalog SIG is that the knowledge of the best patterns to follow in developing Kubernetes-like extensions, which apply, probably 85% of them overlap with you're adding new API surface to Kubernetes itself. There's not a Kubernetes development guide that you can point people to that explains the rationale and the patterns. And in addition to that, I think probably most people on this call are familiar that there are artifacts of several different generations of approaches present in the code. For example, there are lots of different mechanisms in use in different controllers that represent snapshots of what the current thinking about the best way to do things was. And I think it would be really helpful as we now have API aggregation to encourage extensions to Kubernetes to be built in the shape of Kubernetes itself. If we could have some kind of assembled guidance beyond what we currently do for API changes, as an example, we have bits and pieces of the stocks, but we don't have anything that ties it together into a coherent story that somebody entirely new to the space can follow. I think that might be quite a reach, but incremental progress towards that would certainly be really great.
I mean, I think some changes in that space are actually on my list for next quarter, like putting together a walkthrough, a guide,
yeah, we've talked about actually having an SDK for people building new APIs.
Yeah, eventually we're going to get there. I don't think we're going to get a full-fledged SDK next quarter. Right. Maybe by the end of the year if we're super lucky.
Yeah, I mean, this is an area that's evolving as well. So we definitely need to create such a guide. But, actually the people who are both building the extension mechanisms that we're going to be relying on, like API aggregation and initializers, as well as the people using them, like service catalog, are going to be evolving the mechanisms as well as the best practices around that as they do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I expect also that we'll continually evolve those things. And so I don't think that we should wait for the evolution to stop. It is a tricky problem to write to find the right Lagrange point between flex in the system and what we think the eternal truths are. But I think that we can make some progress without being overly skewed towards things that will change immediately as we develop the mechanisms.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting we should wait.
I was hoping that SIG architecture might be a point of escalation when there is designs within SIGs that we can't make a decision on. And then maybe SIG architecture could either help us make the decision or point us in the right direction.
Okay, yeah, one thing we've talked about doing is having office hours. I mean, maybe this meeting could serve, or maybe alternate weeks could serve for that. But that is something we could do.
I'm interested in attending this SIG from the perspective of a brave new multi-repository world and understanding the architectural and technical challenges that will be necessary to accomplish. I also similarly view this as an escalation point for making those decisions.
Just to echo that one little bit, if we are going to be the producers of some consumables, a process document by which we can follow or suggest people to follow for changes that will percolate across repositories would be super helpful.
Someone taking notes?
I am.
Okay.
Anybody else? Okay. All right, Brian, do you want to give a quick overview of the stratification proposal that you've sort of started?
Yeah,
Or
let
do
me
you want
see
to
if
cover
I
something
can
else?
figure out how to present. How do I present anyway? Share screen. Host disabled attendee screen sharing. All right. Jace, can you enable screen sharing? Do you know how to do that?
I think Jace is muted if he's talking to us.
Yeah.
I was just talking to myself, which is, you know, that happens. It should be good now. Try it.
Okay. All right, cool. Okay, so can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so this was the presentation that I did during the summit. It is public, so you should be able to see this document. There's a shortcut link there on the first slide, and I can post that to the chat, I think. I can actually, the way I'm presenting, I can't see the chat anymore. So I'll do it later. So yeah, the stratification that was mentioned looks like this. It was I actually walked through every API, a major function in the system, and try to categorize them. There's a longer document, which some people say is too long, but to try to capture everything and the rationale. And we can definitely discuss that in more detail as we flesh this out and try to write up a concrete proposal and get it approved. But the idea was to try to capture group the functionality in ways that we could build a layered system so you could know what you could depend on when you're adding something to the system. And also as we try to tease pieces apart and pull things into extensions or pull things into other repositories, what would make sense to pull where. So the nucleus, the idea there was kind of to capture the essential bits of Kubernetes, that it would not be considered Kubernetes without those bits, as well as to provide the essential mechanisms needed to build the higher level layers of the system. So that includes the API server, which is kind of the central piece of the control plane, and the kubelet, which, pretty much to do anything in Kubernetes, you need to execute a pod. So you could just say, well, the API machinery itself is the basis for everything. And while that's true, we're not just building API machinery here, we're actually building a system that can execute and manage containers and workloads running in those containers. So I didn't consider it to be Kubernetes without the kubelet. Now these pieces, I would say, I wouldn't consider pluggable in the system. So that was also something I wanted to capture, is in this bit that I call the nucleus, which is the core API machinery control plane, and the execution engine, which is kubelet. Those parts are not considered pluggable. All those pieces that kubelet relies on are pluggable, like the container runtime, the networks, the volume plugins. And I'm being a little bit fuzzy with terminology there because we haven't really settled on the final interface there. I can't see chats if people are chatting at me, but you can feel free to ask questions. The application layer would be the APIs that you would put into a Helm chart or other resource configurations describing your application. So things like deployment or stateful set or even service and ingress, I put at the application layer. And then the governance layer, I put other automation and policy enforcement mechanisms. These kinds of things could be done other ways. Oh, so sorry, one thing about the application layer is that pieces of it are intended to be pluggable. For example, the scheduler is pluggable, the ingress controller is pluggable, even the kube proxy, people have stubbed out and replaced with other mechanisms. So core pieces of the application layer are considered to be pluggable. The governance layer is considered to be more optional, or at least that's my current thinking, because that could be accomplished different ways, and you don't necessarily have to have these kind of policy objects or automation objects in the description of your application topology. So this is kind of a range of things, from things like resource quota and limit range to, on the enforcement side, to horizontal pod autoscaling on the automation side. And then beyond that, the interface layer that clients would be built on. So these are the client libraries that we're now producing. So client SDKs, as opposed to the server side SDK that we proposed earlier, for people building on top of Kubernetes or building other kinds of clients for Kubernetes. So I would actually even put kube control into that layer. You can use the system. Our intent is you should be able to use Kubernetes without necessarily having to use kube control. And we have been trying to pull out complex logic from kube control and actually pull it into the lower layers of the system. So for example, garbage collection, so core resource application lifecycle, we pulled in to the server side of the system. And then beyond that is the ecosystem. And these are things that we would define as being outside of Kubernetes. There may be Kubernetes ecosystem projects. So just so people understand why that is, the CNCF is intended to be a foundation that hosts many different projects which can interoperate and work well together, but aren't necessarily tied to each other. So for example, you can use Linkerd with Kubernetes or Prometheus with Kubernetes, but you can also use them with containers running in other platforms. So I really wanted there to be a home for Kubernetes-specific projects that aren't part of Kubernetes proper, but are part of the ecosystem. And so that's why we have things like COPS and Helm as Kubernetes community projects, even though they're not part of Kubernetes proper in the definition of the scope of Kubernetes, which we've documented for a few years now. So that's the rough idea of the layering, and my general, it is complex. So I am guessing it will evolve over time. And as far as escalations go, I think escalations will help us solidify the boundaries between the layers as we figure out, oh yeah, that's a tricky case. We have an inversion of what we thought the layers should be there. And then we can decide, well, do we need a way to fix that, or should we change the definition of the layers? So, I did look through quite a bit of the system and examples of things built on top of this system to come up with the layering, but I'm sure it's not 100% complete. There have been things added. For example, since I wrote the original proposal, custom resource definitions didn't exist when I wrote the original proposal. The API aggregation wasn't fully built, things like that. So, we'll need to have a living document that we evolve as the system evolves and as the needs of our community evolves. So I want to give some people time to talk.
I'll throw my video on too. I like what I'm seeing. I was putting in chat that Cluster Ops had done. It's not the same layering, but it's a relevant. It's sort of a zoom out click from there about the whole system. So I put some links to that in chat because we'd spent some time actually building up where Kubernetes fits in an environment, and there's some overlap with this in a positive way. So it's nice to see additional clarification there.
Yeah. So also I want to say about the layering, I would imagine that there may be some deployments that want to deploy these layers as broken down into separate components or containers. And in some deployments, they won't want that. So one thing I think we will need to move towards is more flexibility in how we build releases. And we already have Hypercube and separately built components. I think we'll need to expand on that and provide more options for how the components are factored. For people who don't remember, originally the scheduler was part of the controller manager way, way, way back. And when we split out the scheduler from the rest of controller manager, we did that actually as kind of as an experiment to prove that Kubernetes was indeed modular and to prevent the scheduler from becoming entangled with the rest of controller manager. It broke every cluster setup in the universe, just adding that component. So that was one, that did teach us a lesson there. We'll need to figure out how to address that going forward, but I imagine there won't be a one-size-fits-all factoring of the binaries and the other release artifacts like containers packaging the binaries, as well as what processes you actually need to run. Certainly for some scenarios, packaging all of the binaries together in order to reduce the resource footprint, like in a Minikube sort of scenario, for example, might make a lot of sense. And others, they may want more flexibility to replace certain components like the scheduler, which is one of the principal reasons we broke it out also. There can be a number of reasons why you might want to break these things apart, whether it's for fault isolation or scalability reasons or whatever. And that was another thing. This scheduler we envisioned would eventually become resource intensive, and we wanted to be able to scale that out or scale it up rather separately from the other components. But for small clusters, it's more overhead to run more components, and it's more complex to run more components. So I guess what I'm saying is this layering doesn't necessarily imply a particular factoring of the release artifacts.
So it looks like we have a couple minutes left. One of the outstanding questions I got privately was, do we want to have this meeting more frequently? Obviously, you talked about office hours in the off weeks, but should this meeting be extended to an hour?
I think it depends on how we use the meeting. If we have more agenda items than we can get to, then we can potentially expand the time. I wouldn't want to expand the time just to expand the time. Right. So we need to figure out how to make forward progress on the action items we need to do. So once we get a queue of action items, if we're not making sufficient progress offline, we could potentially use the meeting as a working time or to resolve unresolved threads. But until we have that stack of open issues to discuss, I wouldn't expand the time. That's my personal preference.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
I'd definitely like to clear the deck over the next few weeks. I think the SIG is something that we've long delayed. So maybe like the points we're bringing up at the early, like how can we as quickly as possible get some of the things that we know settled and into a written form would be a pretty, I think that's the reason to have meetings, is to get something established here.
Yeah, so I would suggest we actually maybe start by email. So also just to let people know, I am not that responsive to any form of communication because I'm pretty busy. In particular, Slack is good at notifying me as opposed to GitHub notifications, which go into the void. But I can't provide necessarily a synchronous response to Slack. So just be aware of that. I apologize, but there's not a lot I can do about it. Yeah, so maybe starting an email thread about, or start in the agenda doc, fleshing out the issues that we need to get movement on, and maybe assign owners for those things. And if we have owners for those things, we can check on the status of those in the next meeting. If we don't have owners for them, that can be one of the things that we do in the next meeting, is get owners assigned to them.
Okay. So also I'm going to put out another meeting invite for the same time next week that is office hours, and it'll be alternating weeks just as a starting place. And I'll also send out an email to the group saying exactly what you just said, which is let's get an agenda together for the next meeting, which is on the 24th. And if it runs long, then we can move forward from there and not future-proof our meetings with too much time padding. So sound like a plan?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you all for your valuable time and participation. I am looking forward to the next one, and stay tuned on the Google Groups mailing list for more information.
Thanks all.
Okay. Thanks.